Alright, so now let's set up the character and get the movement components done. So down here in the content browser, under the third person BP folder in the blueprints, we'll find the player blueprint, or you can right click right here on him in the actual level, edit player, so we can open that up. I'm going to drag it up and dock it up here. Now under the viewport, this is where you can see all the components attached to your character. So you'll be able to see the camera component, the capsule, his mesh, and anything else that we might add later on. So first thing we want to do is we want to update the mesh to be the actual leaf girl. So with the mesh selected over in the details panel on the right, you can come down to the mesh, skeletal mesh, and then you can swap it out for her. Now, she's just a little bit shorter than the mannequin was, so under transform, I'm going to go to scale and just not 101, good goodness, 1.1, just to make her just a little bit bigger to where she fits in that capsule a little bit better. And the way games work is the skeletal mesh and the animations are just visual representations of basically moving this capsule component. So the capsule component is actually what's going to be moving around. But it's a little bit too big. Generally I like it to be just about shoulder width around her. So with the capsule component selected, we can go over to the details panel, and under the shape you can adjust its half height, which is its height. Oops. Or you can adjust its radius. So I'm going to set the radius to about 22 because what I find works really well is having it just outside the shoulders. So this is what represents basically like if your character takes damage or anything, this is what is actually affected. So with that done, we'll compile that real quick. Come back out here in the content browser and go into the character folder. Now next to these folders, I'm going to right click and go under animation, and we want to create a blend space 1D. What this is, it's a little feature that will allow you to blend between multiple animations based on some variables that we'll input later in the animation blueprint. But we need to create this part first, so I'm going to click blend space 1D, click the skeleton that we want to affect, which is CH34, and I'm going to call this base locomotion underscore BS. I have the mind of a child, so saying BS sometimes makes me giggle. I'm sorry. Alright, I'm going to double click and open that up. And over here on the right in the asset browser, you'll see all the animations that we imported earlier. This graph right here, which if once we have animations out here, you'll be able to see you can move between them. But this graph is where all the animations will sit, and this variable down here is what we can adjust later in the animation blueprint. But for now, I'm going to drag out not that one. Where is it? Oh, my idle animation at the beginning, and you'll see she's updated now. Then I'm going to grab my walk and set it here, and my run and set it here. The actual run, not the flip, but the run. So you'll see to move the preview node, you have to hold the left shift. So if you hold the left shift and then just move your mouse around, you'll see you can blend back and forth, or you can preview the animations based on that value. So you can see how it just blends between all of them. Now we need to give it a variable so we can adjust that later, so it knows where to be on this graph. So in the left, under the asset details, you'll find this axis settings. This horizontal axis setting is this axis. So we'll click that little arrow, and then we'll give it a name. I'm going to call this speed. The minimum axis value is where the graph starts, and the maximum is where it ends. For this character, I want the maximum axis value to be 450 because that's going to be her maximum run speed later on. So now you'll see these values down here have updated. Now my only problem with these is if you're using a controller and you barely move that stick, it'll kind of be wonky with the animations a little bit. So I usually go to the number of, let me just pull this out a little bit. The number of grid divisions, I'm going to bump that up to 8. That gives us a few more lines to add animations to, and gives us just a little bit more control. So I want her to be walking anywhere in this speed range. I want her to just be a normal walk animation. So I'm going to drag out another walk and put it about there. So anywhere in between here, she will have that same animation. But once she gets a little bit above that, then she'll start running. Just makes it look a little bit nicer, in my opinion. So back out here in the content browser, I'm going to right click, go under animation one more time, and to animation blueprint. This is kind of like once you click that, you'll create the animation blueprint. The target skeleton is going to be the CH34 or whatever character you're using. So I'll highlight that and click OK. And I'll name it player. I hit the wrong button. Well, I can tell you now, if you have something selected and you press F2 on the keyboard, you can rename it. So player underscore AnimBP. Now what I was about to say a minute ago is the anim blueprint is kind of like the player blueprint, where if you go into it and go into the event graph, see how it's got this graph that you can add all these nodes to, except for the anim blueprint handles animation to where the event graph handles, input logic. So we'll double click and open up the player anim blueprint, and you will be greeted by this screen. So right here you want to right click and add a state machine. What a state machine is it handles all the different states that your character's animation may be put through. So if you have like a walk or run state, a jump state, we're going to have a double jump, so we'll need a flip, that kind of thing. So we'll double click and open up the state machine, and off of entry we want to add a state called base or initialize, or basically this whatever you want your character's initial animation state to be, such as like an idle walk run like we have. So I'll double click and open that up, drag out that base locomotion that we just set up, hook it up, and then compile it, and you'll see up here that her animation has now changed. Now the only problem is we don't have an actual speed variable hooked up, so even if we applied this to the player blueprint and tried to run around, she would just be floating around in this state. So if we go into the event graph of the anim blueprint, you'll see this event blueprint update animation node. This is basically like an event tick, in which it constantly fires and can be used to check multiple things to see what state her animation needs to be in. So since we want to update off of multiple things, we want to be able to check multiple things. We will hold S on the keyboard and left click for a sequence node. What a sequence node is this will fire off into this, and then each one of these will be checked in sequence. So for the first one, Zen 0, we want to cast to the player blueprint. So you right click, type cast to player, or whatever your character's named, and drag that off. And then we'll use this try get pawn owner and hook it to the object. Casting to a blueprint is one of the ways that one blueprint can interact with another. So when this is called, it will actually reach basically across the game into this blueprint to get the variables. So we can hook that to here. Move this way a little bit. If you box select something and you want to move more precisely, you can use the arrow keys. Comes in handy. Just a little tip. So off of the player blueprint return node, we'll drag off and promote this to a variable called player ref. This will be used later so that we can call functions from this graph without having to cast. Each time you update the animation, though, you will have to cast, but for anim notifies, which we'll get into later, you can just use this variable. It makes it a lot easier. And then after that, off of the return value on the set node, we want to drag off and get velocity. Now the way the game engine works is the entire world exists basically on a grid. So if you look right here, when I have my character selected, or really anything selected, except that, apparently, there's a transform node, or a transform section? Yeah, transform section. And you'll see it has this X, Y, and Z values. This is its position in the world grid. So if I move one of these, you'll see it slides back and forth, left and right, or up and down. So I'm just going to put it back where it was. We're going to delete that, but just leave it where it is right now. So the velocity is the character's movement speed along those vectors. So if I'm running to the right, you'll see that Y value goes up. So that's what the vector is. But in order to check the value of that, we have to drag off here and get that vector length. Because what we need is called a float. This green node, it's a float. It returns a value between, or basically it's a number with a decimal point. But this is a vector, which is just a position on the grid. The velocity is its movement along that vector. So we want to get the length of its movement. Not get length. Just type in vector length. And this will measure basically your starting position and where you're moving and the speed at which you're doing it. So off the return value, we'll promote that to a variable called speed. I have a touch of OCD, so even though I was spelling it right, I had to go back. I like them all capitalized. I don't know why. So when that's done, go into the base state, and we will hook that speed value directly to there. Compile that, and then we can actually apply it to the character and give it a look. So under the viewport, we'll highlight the mesh. Under animation, use animation blueprint of the player anim BP that we just set up, and you'll see her animations are updated. So now if we come out here and press play, when we actually run, she runs. Now her animations are a little herky-jerky or whatever you would call that. But we'll fix that because I don't like that. So back in the player blueprint, in the components tab, down at the very bottom you'll see this character movement. This is what handles all the logic for your character to be able to move. So with that highlighted, you'll go into the details panel, and under max acceleration, which acceleration is basically how fast your character can get from idle to its full run speed. 2048 is why it just jumps straight to max speed almost. So I'm going to set that to about 768. Sorry. You can play with the values to see what you like. This seems to work pretty well. The braking friction factor is how fast your character will stop once you let go of the input buttons. So right now it's set to 2, which is why she just basically instantly stops. Which isn't very realistic. Like if you take off running and then you stop, you're going to kind of take a few steps to stop. So I usually like to put this at about 0.5. So anything at 1 or above seems to just stop her instantly, but 0.5 gives her a little bit of a kind of slowdown. Now under the character movement walking, we want to set her max walk speed to 450. So that it'll match our locomotion blend space. Now under the braking deceleration, this and this don't really seem to affect each other. Well, I can't really say that. It's hard to explain what this one does, but it's basically, I just put it at 0 and it smoothens everything out. But it's basically the braking force applied to her when you stop pushing a button. So once you set that to 0, you'll see now she kind of, it's a little bit smoother transitions into the different states. This looks a little bit nicer. So, but one thing you will notice right now is if you try to jump, she just runs in the air. So the way to fix that is back in the player anim blueprint. We're going to drag this back a little bit. In case you're not in this one, I'm just in that base node. I'm going to right click and blend poses by bool. Now a boolean, or a bool, is basically a yes or a no. So is something happening? If yes, do this. If yes, do this. If not, do this. So the variable we want to check is if the character is falling. So in the event graph, we'll box select the cast to player, copy it with Control C, and then Control V to paste. Or you can hit Control W and it duplicates. For some reason, I just really like using Control C, Control V, probably from so long of doing it that way. But off that, as the player will drag off and type is falling. This will automatically grab the character movement component and then check to see if it's attached to the ground. If it's not, then it will register that it is falling. So we'll drag up and promote that to a variable called jumping. And that will be the answer to our yes or no question for over here. So is the character jumping? If not, play this. If so, play our falling animation. And then we'll hook that right there. So now back out here, she can jump. But since it's a platformer game, a double jump would probably come in handy. And it's just fun to do. So what we can do is inside the well, let's save real quick. Alright, so right here on top of the content browser, there's the Save All button, which will just save everything you've done. In case the engine crashes, it brings it right back up. You're right where you left off. But with that done, in the player blueprint, we will go into the event graph and get rid of the touch input and the VR thingy. And we'll find this jump. We'll delete the comment box around it. And we'll drag it down to make ourselves some room. And the first thing we want to do is drag this away. And we want to find out if the character is already jumping. So I'll hold B on the keyboard and left click for a branch. Alternatively, you can also right click and type in, and you can get all those different nodes, but I'm going to show you all the different shortcuts, like S for a sequence, D for a delay, etc. So we will hook this to here, and what we want to check here, we'll drag out the character movement, and we want to do the same thing and see if they're already falling. If they're not, then we want them to jump. If they are, then we want to see if they've already double jumped. So we'll add a variable over here under the My Blueprint, go to Variables, and there's this plus sign right here where you add a variable. Click that, and I'm going to create a new boolean called flipped. Then I'll do another B, left click for a branch, and I'll hook that flipped up right there. So if they have not flipped, we want them to be able to double jump again. But as soon as they have, we want them to set that they are already flipped. So we'll drag out that and set that they have, so that if we fire through this again, it won't let it fire off a multiple time. We're going to add one more variable called flipping. And this is just to handle the animation state in a minute. So this will basically be what allows us to transfer from that base state to a flip animation state. And then we'll be able to switch it back off so that she goes back to her normal falling state. This is what handles the actual logic of letting her not be able to fire this off again. So we'll drag out the flipping and set it, and you can hook it just like that so that whatever this value is, this value becomes. Then at the end of that, right click, and we want to type launch character and hook that up like that. Right here is a Z override. What this will do is it'll immediately zero out, like if you click this, it'll immediately zero out her falling velocity or jumping velocity and make it this. Without this, then if she's falling faster than whatever this is, it won't really apply. It'll just slow her down. But it wouldn't really work as a double jump. It'd be more like an air brake type thing. So I'm going to click Z override. And I'm going to say 500. I think 500 is what I used in the preview thing. So we'll do that. So doing it this way, this would, there's nothing telling us that we're releasing this. So doing it like this you would basically be able to double jump only one time throughout the game. We want to be able to turn that off, so I'm going to right click and create a custom event. A custom event is basically a function like you would find over here, but I like to just keep them all close when they're like this. So we're going to call it flip check, I guess. And basically what this event is going to do is it's going to start firing off and checking if the character has touched the ground again. And then once she has, then it'll turn that flipped back off so that once you jump again, you'll be able to do all this. So flip check, we'll right click and we'll call that event or function right at the end. So for flip check, we want to do a branch, right click, type is falling, and hook that up just like we have over here. And if she is still falling, then we want to do a delay. So D, left click for a delay. And we'll set it something really small, so 0.01. And this is just like, it'll get to this node, wait that amount of time, and then continue. So if she's still falling, then we want to recall this flip check. Because what this will do is it calls itself again and then checks again, and if she's still falling, just continues this cycle. You can't do it like this though. Like if you have it just right here, I'll show you. It'll just do an infinite loop. Since there's no delay, it's just constantly firing the same thing over and over again. So we need that little delay in there in order to prevent that error from firing. So now if you see, yeah. Alright, and once this is called, it'll continue to call until this false statement is reached. So what we want it to do when she's not falling anymore, take the question mark, the flipped, we'll set it back to false. And then we don't want to call it again. We want it to just basically end its cycle. So now, if we compile real quick, she can double jump. And then when she lands, she can double jump again. Now, as nice as that is, it's not as good as it could be. So let's set up that flip animation real quick. So in the player anim blueprint, we'll go back to the state machine we created, and off the base we want to drag off, so not here because you'll just drag it around, go into this gray area right beside it, and drag off and add a state called flip. So you want one arrow going to it and another one coming back. What these are transition rules. So basically it's what allows it to go from this state to this state, and this one is what allows it to go back. So we want to use that flipping boolean that we used earlier, not the one with the question mark, but this one. So in the event graph, we'll box select that one more time, Control C, Control V. Now up here on the sequence node, you'll see this add pin. It'll let us add basically as many of these as we want. I've seen them up to like 50 sequence things, so they go a ways. We'll hook that up to the cast to player. We'll drag off and type in flipping. Now we want to get the flipping without the question mark, because the question mark is asking, has she done it? And this one is basically saying she's doing this. So from flipping, we'll promote that to a variable called flipping. Set flipping to flipping. Then we'll compile that real quick. You'll notice that I got a few errors, but we're about to fix that. It's basically that we haven't set up these transition rules yet. So I'll come back in here to the state graph, click the transition rule going from base to flip, drag out that flipping node and hook it directly in. And then for the flip to base, we want to drag out that same flipping node, get it, drag off and see if she is no longer flipping. So drag off, type in not, and that'll give you the not boolean, which is basically this is equal to no, and then it transitions. So now under the flip, inside the flip graph, we want to drag out that forward flip animation, hook it up, and over in the settings panel, make sure that loop animation is set to false. Now we want to double click and open this up because we need to add what is called an anim notify. Basically, an anim notify is something that's fired off somewhere in point during this graph, and it'll let us call functions or events based on its, whatever we have hooked to it. So at the very end of the graph, under notifies on this first track for the notifies, I'll right click and add a notify called end flip. I'll move it all the way to the very end because we want it to be at the very, very end of it. Now what we can do is in the player anim blueprint, in the event graph, to the right of all of this, we will right click and type in end flip to get that notify. We will drag out the player ref, and then we can just set flipping back to false. And then if we come back out here, now she's double jumping. And then when she's done with that, she goes straight back into her normal falling animation. Now one last thing that we'll do in this video is adjust the camera just because I don't like it that close. So inside the player blueprint, back in the components tab of the viewport, you go to the camera boom, and this is what attaches the camera to the character by this red target arm. So with the camera boom selected, go to the target arm length in the details panel, and I'm going to set it to, I don't remember if it was 350 or 400, but I'm also going to move it up. Now you don't want to just move the camera up because it'll take it off that, and it can mess with your camera rotation and all that kind of stuff, make it clip through cameras or clip through walls and such. So you want it to stay attached to this. But I'll drag that up to where, maybe not there. A lot of this is kind of try something, test it, tweak it. Let's see. That looks nice. So yeah, not too bad. And now you've got a running, jumping, flipping character. Yeah, so in the next one we'll start setting up some more interactable stuff, maybe the collectibles, maybe launch pads, I'm not quite sure yet, but we will see you in the next one. So see you in the next one, bye.